Hello, this is Farrell Vincent with Nation 473. I'm coming to you guys today with a video update on a question I got from one of our subscribers. And specifically, it was a question on a video where I'm asking for, feedback and ideas for things that need to be explained better in the game, or maybe concepts that I haven't fully explained or just couldn't really think of like a great example, or it's not easy to type. There's tons of ideas for this, but really what it comes down to is I want to make you guys a lot more content as time goes on. I want to be able to explain different aspects of the game that you may have questions on, and if I have a video already, I will absolutely link that. If I don't, or if it's super outdated, I may be making a new one. And that's the whole point of the series. So today, I want to go over wounded ratio and specifically what sources are there, where are they at, and which ones stack. Because that last question I've never explained to anyone. And to be fair, if I tried to explain it back when I was making some of those videos that covered that content, I'd have actually gotten it wrong, because I have learned since then how certain breakthroughs work, and like alliance skills and the Biochemical Hospital, right? Like I've learned how these things work in a little bit more detail. So let's jump into the easier parts, and then let's go piece by piece. So I want to start with the major two components. These are the biggest two. Everyone will automatically get research, specifically under the development, and there is the first aid skill. This gives you wounded ratio. And the second piece of this wounded ratio comes from this piece. And again, that's 10% from the academy, and there is an additional 10% from the garage. Right? So down here, you have rescue. Rescue gives you 10%. So every city after, around I want to say it's like 24 to 26 when you can get all of them, is going to have a wounded ratio of 20% base. So any of your C30s, generally speaking, are always going to have 20% wounded ratio. So that's the base floor. And now that we know what the base floor is, I want to talk a little bit about what does wounded ratio do, this specific wounded ratio. Because we'll talk about the other sources at the end, because this is the first parts that apply. So what it ends up doing is when you go into a battle and you are going to lose any number of troops, it determines how many of the troops are permanently lost versus the wounded units. So with 0 wounded ratio, when you very first start the game, you will lose every single troop on attack. All of them, 100% of the time. You will only start keeping troops with wounded after you get your first percentage point of wounded ratio. So when you're like C15 and you don't quite yet have all of the academy research or the garage research going, you will lose everything in an attack that gets killed and nothing gets saved. Then this is like a really small piece of this, because we can talk about like, what percentages there are, because obviously you can see in this battle report, right, like everyone's losing different amounts. I am losing a lot less troops than I'm wounded, and Vendetta here has a lot more losses than his wounded units because his wounded ratio is lower. So how do we get this up? How do we get this past 20% base, right? Oh, and I can show you on a scouting report too, now that I'm thinking about it. Kind of the difference between these. So there's a piece of this question, which is how can I see my wounded ratio? And it's not in your stats at all. You will not be able to see this without knowing which pieces to calculate where, or having a good friend of yours just scout your city if they're C30 or above, because down here in the stats, you will find, when I can find it, I'm sure somebody is shouting at the screen, Vincent, you're missing it. There it is, wounded ratio. And you can see here that this particular individual has 20%, which is the base floor. So they have no wounded ratio added on whatsoever. This is just the absolute base. Whereas somebody like Bob here has, let's see, 41.1% wounded ratio. So the best way to know exactly what your wounded ratio is by having someone scout you. But it's really easy to calculate. So once you know you have 20% base, or if you are still leveling up, you can add up those two. And then the other two sources for base wounded ratio. And again, I'm going to call this base because it's the first calculation that applies. This is the biggest chunk. It's also the highest scaling. Is from your strategy officers, specifically Saki and Morgan. If you are following any of my guides or ways of doing things, although some people, and it's perfectly fine if you do, will have wounded ratio on Brave Star. The only reason why I don't, because I do like the putting wounded ratio on Brave Star. We'll talk about that at the very end of the video in more of the advanced strategies. But the main reason I don't is because I don't have a lot of levels on Brave Star, because right now I'm really trying to level every other officer, and I would rather focus on that piece than focusing on, specifically getting the best possible outcome, right? To me, this is the min-max approach, and I'd rather do it this way without the min-max. And there's a lot of work with that. So again, we'll talk about that strategy at the very end. So for me, specifically, 15.3% on both means that I've got a total of 30.6. You add that to the 20, I have a little bit over 50% wounded ratio. Super easy to understand on that one because they are exactly the same. 15.3, 5-star officers, both level 55. Super simple to calculate for me. Yours may be different depending on levels, depending on star, right? It does go up. I do recommend getting first aid on these two officers to around level 10, as you will be able to hit around the 40% mark pretty easy with 4-star officers. If you're lower than that, you may not get quite that high, but hitting 10% is actually not super hard. Getting past 10% kind of sucks. And for anyone who's wondering, this goes up by 1.1 per rank, which means that it'll max out at a total of what I think it's like 22. If I'm mathing this correct, no, there's another 5, so it'd be 20.8. So just a little bit under 21% for the last 5 levels for me. And this is again the absolute max. So this is what we're talking about here. So, when you add all those up, right, 20.8 on each, that's 40, plus the 20 base is 60, or 61%. Still really good. 61% wounded ratio is insane, right? Because that means that 60% of your troops that you would have lost are now in your hospital rather than dead. So this is what I mean when I say it's the biggest chunk. So, okay, that's the first part of the calculation figured out and done. So again, whatever's lost, you take that first set of wounded ratio, and then you're going to have more lost units. And this is where all of the other sources affect, and they all affect them differently, unfortunately. So we're going to talk about that because it doesn't just add up. They all affect them individually from what's left. So one of these sources is going to be rescue from Alexandria, specifically this skill. You can see here. For 1 hour, 16% of your troops killed while attacking will be converted to wounded until your hospital is full. This is an additive 16% after the other calculations. So what ends up happening is, let's say you're losing 100,000 troops. You have a 60% wounded ratio, which means that 60,000 troops go into your hospital. There's 40,000 remaining. This will give you an additional 16% of your troops that would be killed of those 40,000. So drop a decimal point over, that's 4,000. Add an extra half, that's 6,000 troops that this would save. In this particular example of, again, 40,000 remaining. Again, it is at the end. So you do the first calculation, you get what the pool is left, right? You finish the equation, and then you start the equation all over, kind of, for her. And I say kind of because there's two other sources. One of those is the Biochemical Hospital. You can see I have some. So the Biochemical Hospital also has a conversion ratio. It is 11%. So you have taken an extra 6,000 off the original equation. Your Biochemical Hospital here will take 11% off of what is left, right? So you just keep going down and down and down. So now you have 11% of the next total, which again is 6,000 less than the original. So that is 34,000. So at 11%, you're looking at, 3,400 plus an extra like 300. So like 3,700 or so off that total. For the sake of the fact that I'm trying to do pretend math in my head in the middle of making a video, we're just going to, round that up to 4. So that way I can just say we have 30,000 remaining. So those then will pop into the Biochemical Hospital. These, you get nutrients. There is a limit, but there's also a maximum that you can get of the total limit and speed, right? So like you get 20 per second, and there's a max of 300,000 for me at my level, which may not actually give you all of the 31,000 troops back that I have as my total limit in this hospital. So pro tip, if you ever go into a void and it's super bloody, just come in here and keep clicking this max button and recover every, 3-4 hours. Because it will stop and you will never get a pop-up. So you're just going to hit max, recover, until eventually you get them all back. Or you can always click this little button up here and use the biochemical serum that you used to give to the girls until they got up to level, 17 or whatever the heck their max level is. I don't even remember anymore. I don't look. I think it's level 17. Yeah. So this part right here where it said heal, you use those and you can actually get them faster if you would like to recover quickly. And I tend to do that a lot, especially once you max out, because there's really no other use for it. So 30,000 troops remaining. Again, we got some from the Alexandria scale. We've got some now in our Biochemical Hospital. But let's say, hypothetically speaking, we've activated the last source, and this is an alliance source. So specifically, it is this one right here. So it is emergency room. What ends up happening with the emergency room is it will then take 10%, or sorry, in this case, 30% or whatever the current effect is, over the course of the duration, and it will put it into this little hospital down here that says emergency room that you can then spend alliance points to restore your troops. As far as I know, there's actually no duration on how long you have for troops to stay in here. Like I've come in, a few days later and done it too. Like I want to say there's no limit. Somebody may correct me if I'm wrong, because I just don't remember. I usually never leave them in here very long, so that's my own fault. But this is commonly activated during like a void, right? The cool thing about emergency room, though, is it does go into effect even if you're in group attacks. So it really helps if you're going to have a particularly bloody void like we are. But again, 30%. So, okay, we've got 3,000 or sorry, 30,000 troops remaining. This would then get, 30% of that. So again, the easiest way to do calculations on percentages is just move a decimal point over to the left one. That would be 3,000. And then times it by 3 to get a total of 30. So 9,000 troops. So now we're at 21,000 troops lost. And that's it. We've hit the end. So we're at 21,000 troops lost, and we have saved that. I will say I'm not 100% sure what order this trio goes into, because I've never been in a place where emergency room and Alexandria were active at the same time. In theory, emergency room could go first, and if it does, then that starting number gets really high and you actually lose even less troops overall. Again, sorry that I don't really know which order it applies in. I just know that Alexandria is first when it comes to biochemical. So I think the biochemical may be at the very end of the calculation, and it's probably emergency room Alexandria biochemical, but again, I'm not 100% sure here. And depending on what order that goes in, it really does change the calculations. Because you're doing percentages of a smaller number, and then you do another percentage of the smaller number and another percentage of the smaller number, you're never going to get to 100%. You're never going to get to full efficiency. And I can tell you that that absolutely happens, because in theory, if that were the case, this 30% plus that 11% plus my 50% means that I should have only ever lost like 20% of my troops in a void, and I do lose more than 20%, even with all of those activated. It's a little bit over. It's not a lot over, but it does go that route, right? You do have that scaling down effect of wounded ratio. So that is all the sources. That is how it works. Again, unfortunately, there's no way to ever get to a true 100% for that hour duration, even with the breakthrough skill, but you can get pretty darn close. And they do all add up. So, like, don't get me wrong, it's great to have, but it's not as amazing as you may think. The kind of last little caveat to all of this comes down to the Void Potion. And I want to bring this up in its own segment, because with the Void Potion specifically, it will factor in again, and guess what? Even lower. So the lowest I think you could theoretically get to is like 2 to 5% troops lost if you had everything else maxed. Again, this is me doing some rough, like, ideal math, depending on which way the calculations roll out. But my only issue with the Void Potion is it's super expensive, and honestly, not very worth it. The troops are so much easier to recruit and will save you a lot of money that I don't really recommend the Void Potion unless you just have a fortune to burn and that's what you feel like doing. So up to you, but I don't use them. And that is every source that I'm aware of right now of wounded ratio and how all of that kind of breaks down, maths out. So that's like the ideal scenario for all of this. I do recommend getting that primary source up, right? This is easily the most beneficial piece, is the officer piece. And it's not that expensive. It is worthwhile to get this because that does add up quite a bit. And I'm going to end this video on the last tip on wounded ratio and wounded in general. And it has to do with the Brave Star thing. So what a lot of people do is they will launch their attack, come into this particular screen, click on their Brave Star, and hit a point. If, in theory, your Brave Star is 5 stars and has the breakthrough unlocked, and you have your wounded ratio first aid on him, and he is of significant level that it doesn't really hamstring you like it would for me, what you would have happen is post-war rescue. The reason why this particular ability is great is because it will save you speed ups. A lot of speed ups, especially in the higher levels too, because I believe this caps out at around, I want to say it's like 26% or 18%. I can't remember the exact number. I think it's 18. But even still, like 18% less troops in those calculations, right, that are instantly revived adds up a lot in the bigger numbers. So for those old world players or those C-38s or those guys that have all of their officers maxed out anyways, I would start to level up Brave Star for the trick and eventually move First Aid off of Morgan and onto Brave Star so that you can do the flip. And when you do the flip, you can get those wounded back and not have to spend the speed ups to heal them. The other thing, though, for any of the non-loss events, you can also still do the trick. So if you have this unlocked, like I do, you can do the post-war rescue trick in Chaos Lands and Ironblood Battlefield, in Void, in Frenzy, in, you know, Global Conquest. There we go. That's the one I was looking for. You can do those in any of the events where your city is under attack. And what that generally looks like is going to be something like, let's find one where I've actually still got it active. Right there. And so you'll see the post-war rescue in effect, survivors, blah, 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 blah. And that is the 12 point something percent of the 2.9 thousand in this case. But this is how you know that the Brave Star effect worked, and it really adds up. Because, even at 12%, that's, that could be a couple of days worth of healing. So, pro tip, if you really want to eke out every possible advantage that you possibly can, switch out your Morgan for Brave Star. And if anyone is wondering to themselves why Morgan and not Saki, is because Saki's breakthrough skill, you need to have her equipped in order to get the benefit, whereas Morgan's breakthrough skill is trash. Okay, cool. So, again, Morgan to launch the attack, switch over to Brave Star, pop the post-war rescue with all of that there. I mean, it's the glorious dream, and it's hectic as hell. It's really hard to do, especially if people are doing speed attacks. So I don't like it personally, but I'll probably end up doing it someday because I'll eventually succumb to the pressure. But until then, this is what you get. I also do it for all of my SOSs. So, also, this needs to happen, the switch needs to happen before the end of the battle. So, that's what you need to know. It does need to happen before the end of the battle. So if you get it in there when the map has already generated, it's not that big of a deal, but I don't know. It just gives you an extra point to fail, so careful. And that is everything I can tell you about wounded ratio, as well as a couple little tricks on how to save some healing in various events. So as always, please leave a comment down below if you have any questions about this. I know there's a lot of moving pieces. And consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us out a lot. And as always, I will see you on the next one. Have a good day.